A lot of times, I think we're all pretty familiar with the scientific consensus that exists under the auspices of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is recommending that in order to avert catastrophic climate change, we cut our global greenhouse gas emissions in half by the middle of the century, below 2005 global emissions. And this presentation just begins from the assumption that this is something that we should do. So I'm not going to actually argue for why we should reduce emissions. That would be a different presentation. But I want to begin by taking a look at what this challenge would actually require. So you see here 2005 global emissions, the target set by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2050. Now, if every American installed 5 compact fluorescent light bulbs, or CFLs, you would get a very small reduction here. It's really almost immeasurable, a statistically insignificant amount, and obviously most emissions still to go. If every human being on Earth planted 10 trees, this was to be every, not every, Y-E, you get another, a little bit, you can start to see the line, but not much. You still have quite a bit to go. If every US car were a Prius, now you can kind of see something there. Still a lot to go. If we replaced every coal-fired power plant in India, a country of 1 billion people, with a clean source of energy, you'd get a bit more of a reduction there. I mean, it's starting to show, but still obviously a lot to go. Now, what if we did the same in the United States? Well, there we're getting a much bigger chunk, but still a lot to go. And every single coal-fired power plant in China, you can see, comprising the bulk of that, and you still have quite a bit to go. Let's look at that. I want to look at that technological challenge, which will be the subject of most of my talk tonight, in a different way. In December 2007, energy experts with the International Energy Agency described what it would take to reduce emissions 50% by 2050. The IEA is sort of the most respected non-governmental organization on energy questions. This is the presentation that they made to United Nations diplomats in Bali. And just the caveat here is they said they're not saying this is the only way, but gives you a sense of the scale of the technological challenge. So you would need to build 30 new nuclear power plants around the world. We haven't built a new one in the United States for over 30 years. You would need 17,000 wind turbines being fairly hotly resisted all around the United States and the world by neighbors who don't like the way they look or the sound of them. 400 biomass power plants, most of which are very small scale at this point. 2 dams the size of China's Three Gorges Dam. Has anybody ever seen a photo of the Three Gorges Dam? Has anybody ever seen it? It makes the Hoover Dam look small. It's taken about 50 years to build, and I believe it's still filling up. And 42 coal or natural gas power plants with carbon capture and storage, a technology that is really only partially demonstrated. And they said you wouldn't do this once, you'd have to do it every year, all of these things every year from 2013 to 2030. Really an unprecedented technological project. So what is our plan to reduce emissions by the amount that we need to? Well, I think we're all familiar with the Kyoto Treaty that the United States has not ratified, but many other countries have. Well, here is a graph that was created by one of the lead authors, Tom Wigley, for the United Nations panel. He said, here's what would happen, here's what warming would likely be if we didn't do anything, and here's what the warming would be with Kyoto. So you can see it's essentially irrelevant in terms of temperature. It would delay reaching a 2 degrees centigrade increase by maybe about 10 years, actually less than 10 years, about 5 years. So really Kyoto at an ecological level is irrelevant. The protocol itself is based on 2 other frameworks or models for dealing with pollution problems. The first is the Montreal Protocol, which was negotiated and signed in 1989 to phase out CFCs, which destroy the ozone layer, create a hole in the ozone layer. And the second is a law passed in 1990 called a cap and trade law to phase out the use, or to phase out the pollutant sulfur dioxide, which creates acid rain. And the idea of a cap and trade law is that you would cap total emissions every year, and that cap would go down. So if you want to reduce emissions 80% in the United States, which would be our target, you would need to have that cap come down about 2% a year, and then that firms that reduce their emissions more rapidly than other firms could sell their emissions reductions to firms that are having a harder time making the reductions. That's the idea of cap and trade. And in fact, when you look at the mental model that environmental leaders bring to global warming, they bring, this is sort of a classic quote from the New York Times, the lesson from Montreal is that curbing global warming will not be as hard as it looks. That's from really one of the leading environmental lobbyists on climate change, which when you kind of think about it, you're like, geez, it's not going to be as hard as you look, but you realize that low-cost alternatives to ozone-depleting chemicals were actually invented before Montreal. And in the context of all that technological innovation and building that you saw, it seems a bit naive to suggest that this will be as simple as replacing a chemical that we used for air conditioning and in aerosols. Now, in the case of acid rain, it was actually made possible by the fact that we had inexpensive scrubbers and low-cost low-sulfur coal already available. So instead of having to do all that building that we saw in those first few slides, new power plants, new wind farms, they just needed to attach some scrubbers to smokestacks or use a different fuel source, a low-sulfur coal from places like Wyoming and New Mexico, which really didn't have much impact at all on electricity prices for most people affected. Now, in the case of global warming, much more complicated situation in terms of the pollutants involved, because there's not one greenhouse gas, there's actually several. You can see carbon dioxide, which comprises 77% of total greenhouse gases, coming from many sources: transportation, electricity and heat, other fuel combustion, industry. Then there's sort of land use changes, deforestation, agricultural practices comprising about 20% of emissions. Here's agriculture, and then waste. So a much more complex challenge you can see here than phasing out a simple chemical. Now, the good news is that we have some real-world examples to look at in efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is Europe. So the first thing most people will be surprised to learn is that Europe's emissions actually went up twice as fast than the United States' between 2000 and 2005. This was during a period when they were working on setting up their compliance with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Germany and Britain, which are two of Europe's biggest countries, did reduce their emissions between 1990 and 2005, but they did so for reasons that had nothing to do with global warming. Margaret Thatcher in the late 80s got into a big battle with the coal miners' union, and for a variety of other reasons, North Sea natural gas became available, and Britain switched to natural gas, again for non-global warming reasons, and natural gas being about half as polluting as coal. And Germany, the East German economy collapsed after the fall of communism, and they took a lot of their older coal-fired power plants offline and promptly shipped them to China. But if you take Germany and Britain out of the calculation, European emissions have actually risen by 10% during that period. Now, when you count emissions by the emissions from all the products that we consume, rather than just the emissions that we make in our own cars and factories and power plants, Britain's emissions, for example, actually rose 19% rather than declining 15%. In other words, if you count all the products, for example, that British folks bought from China, their emissions actually have gone up rather than down. Now, Europe, if it meets its Kyoto targets at all, will mostly meet them through what are called carbon offsets, which is where you pay other people to reduce emissions. But what has been shown is that most of these offsets are being purchased from things that would have happened already. So, for example, if you're a European firm and you want to reduce your emissions, you might buy credits from companies that are building dams in China, and the argument is, well, if they're building dams rather than coal-fired power plants, then they're not bringing as many emissions online. The problem, of course, being that Europe doesn't actually get to the work of transitioning its own energy sources, and those are dams that would have almost certainly been built regardless of any additional money from Europe. Now you can see, just to get a sense of perspective, China's total emissions in 2006 were 1.7 gigatons of carbon. China's emissions between 2007 and 2010 are going to grow the exact same amount that were the total emissions from Australia, the UK, Canada, Germany, and Japan combined. So if you're Germany and you were to like cut your emissions by 80%, you would only have reduced your emissions by a fraction of what China brought on in a single year. Which leads us to, I don't know how many of you ever played that fortune cookie game where you add the words "in bed" to the end of the fortune. Because anyone ever play that? It's a fun game. It makes the fortunes much more funny. If we sort of play, we think there's like a lie detector test you can play with anybody who says anything about global warming. You just add the words "in China" afterwards. So people say things like, well, we have all the technologies we need to deal with global warming, and you add the words "in China," and you can ask yourself whether or not it's actually true. Now, Barbara Boxer has said if the United States leads, other nations like India and China will follow. That's sort of the conventional wisdom. I mean, literally, we encounter it all the time. Once we act on a cap and trade proposal in the United States, China and India will be right there behind us. And I always point out, yeah, they've certainly, yeah, I think the last time China followed us on anything was somewhere around the Opium Wars of the 19th century. China, they're very polite in listening to Westerners offer our sage advice, and they most of the time wisely reject it. And in fact, in this case, the Chinese government has been quite clear. You cannot tell people who are struggling to earn enough to eat that they need to reduce their emissions. China, having passed the United States as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases last year, still has a per capita rate of emissions just 15% of ours. And you can see when you look at energy consumption, this in the equivalent of oil, you can see that energy consumption is strongly correlated with being wealthier and more developed. So the poorest parts of the world, like Africa and Southeast Asia and much of the Amazon and Brazil and Central America, very low energy consumers. And I'm going to skip that. And you can see that what's going to happen between now and the end of the century is that the amount of energy that's going to be consumed by human beings is going to basically quadruple, triple or quadruple, maybe double or triple by the middle of the century. And that's going to happen no matter what we do, and no matter how much science accumulates on global warming. Energy consumption is going to increase along with population and global development, as will wealth. So everyone's going to get a lot richer. You can see between over this next century. And the other big shift that will occur, and consistent with Fareed Zakaria's new book, The Post-American World, you'll see that right now, the developing world, poorer countries, constitute about a third of global GDP. Well, by the end of this century, they'll constitute 3/4 of global GDP, and of course, they won't be the developing world anymore. They will be part of the developed world. I'm going to skip that. So now, a lot of folks, our book had the good fortune of being a critical of environmentalists and suggesting that the environmental strategy on global warming wasn't working. We had the good fortune of having it come out the week that Al Gore won the Nobel Prize, and everybody sort of was like, "What are you talking about? Al Gore just won the Nobel Prize, and everything has changed. You guys are just trying to rest on your 2004 essay." So one of the things that we pointed out is that, and everybody thought, is that there was a tipping point in public opinion. After Al Gore's movie came out, man, everything changed. Everybody knew that now global warming was something we had to take seriously, and now we're really going to get with the program. And you can see that at the height of when Al Gore's movie came out, as in June of 2006, his movie came out, I think, the week before, global warming ranked as an issue about 13th for Democrats and independents, with 56% of Democrats and 49% of independents saying that was very important, 23% of Republicans. Less than a year later, it actually declined in importance, as you can see here. And in fact, the more recent polling by Pew, this is all by Pew, by the way, which is one of the big environmental funders, has shown that global warming's importance has actually declined even more dramatically in the face of the declining economy. So we don't find that global warming is a particularly important issue for most Americans. Now, another fair question to ask, though, is with all of the emphasis on global warming's potential scary impacts, does that sort of communication actually motivate the kind of ecological action that we all want to see? And of course, we've seen it with Time and others. We're supposed to be scared, in case you had any doubt. And you can see the polar bear there, I guess, is a reason why we're supposed to be scared. And of course, the movie itself, by far the most terrifying film you will ever see. So that was the idea, is that this is something to be really scared of. But it's an interesting story. In the year 2000, Ted Turner, who's the founder of CNN and an environmental philanthropist, hired cognitive psychologists to find out how people reason about global warming. These psychologists showed videos of disasters and explained the threat, and then they held focus groups and asked people what they thought. Here's what this is right verbatim from the report. The cognitive psychologist said, "The layering on of dire consequences then reinforces that the problem is too big to address. The likely response for the public is adaptation to Mother Nature. Instead of supporting increased cafe or fuel economy standards, for example, they are likely to buy an SUV to help them through the erratic weather to come." So what we find is that these fear-based appeals, quite understandably, people start to think about how do I survive it rather than how do I reduce my carbon footprint. Now, a lot of folks forget, what did Al Gore, what did he mean when he said that there was an inconvenient truth? What was the inconvenient truth? Well, the inconvenient truth was this. It's the truth about the climate crisis is an inconvenient one. That means we're going to have to change the way we live our lives. And if you ever saw the movie, I don't think you would doubt that he meant that we would change our lives for the worse, not for the better. That this was something that would require some sacrifice in our standard of living. So it raises another question. Is calling for sacrifice good politics? Does it help us to achieve our policies? Well, you can see that the discourse of sacrifice has really penetrated public consciousness. So of the 67% who told pollsters that it was possible to reduce the effects of global warming, 39% said it would take major sacrifices, and 23%, a little bit more than half, said that it would be done through technology. Obviously, I am in that 23%, and I wish more people were, but obviously my colleagues in the environmental movement have been emphasizing for a very long time that dealing with this problem would require major sacrifices. Now, when you ask people, would you support increasing taxes on gasoline so that people either drive less or buy cars that use less gas, in the context of, by the way, of a question about reducing global warming, you find 68% who just say, no, I don't want to pay more for gasoline, or we find a similar answer in terms of paying more for electricity in order to conserve energy. But when you ask the question in a different way, which is, would you be willing or not willing to pay higher taxes on gasoline and other fuels if the money was used for research into things like solar and wind, you find a huge level of support. About 64% total of voters. In fact, other surveys find it even higher, and that it's actually gone up more. And this is the finding that we discovered back in 2002 when we founded something called the Apollo Alliance to push for major investments in clean energy, and which was rejected by the environmental lobby in Washington, who felt like what we needed to do was to get people to pay more for fossil fuels so that they would consume less and consume differently. So it raises a question. If the fundamental strategy for dealing with global warming is to make fossil fuels cost more, will we actually do that? Will human beings make fossil fuels cost more, and arguably a lot more, in order to deal with global warming? Well, let's just take a look at some of the economics of this. Coal is cheap. For whatever else you'd say about it, it's just 4.8 cents a kilowatt hour. These numbers from the Energy Information Administration, but they were also confirmed to me by a major corporate purchaser of electricity. And you can also see, and you see solar PV, photovoltaics, is over 5 times more expensive. And of course, that's only when the sun is shining. The cost of storing it would raise it. And you'd have to have a price on carbon. This is a little wonky, but you'd have to have a price on carbon that was $220 per ton. Wind is a lot cheaper. It's only about 50%, 30 to 50% more than coal, again, when it's windy. So you need a smaller price for carbon. Solar thermal about 3 times as expensive as coal, and you would need about a $90 price for CO2. Now, there's a bunch of barriers to clean energy. When I first started doing advocacy for environmental issues, I was raised on Amory Lovins and others who said that clean energy was basically just as cheap as fossil fuels, and the only reason that we don't have clean energy everywhere is that we subsidize fossil fuels, and that there's this big fossil fuel lobby in Washington that prevents clean energy from taking hold. But as I've learned more, we've discovered that in fact it's fairly well understood among energy experts that there's a lot of barriers to scaling up clean energy. The first is obviously that things like solar are much more expensive than coal and natural gas. The second thing is that solar and wind both require new transmission lines and storage, which really increases the cost. So we're nearing the point of capacity on wind, which means that if you want to expand wind production, you'd have to build a lot of transmission lines to places like the Dakotas. The Department of Energy estimates that would cost about $60 billion to build all the transmission lines that you would need to bring wind up to about 20% of our energy mix, which is what we did with nuclear after World War II. We brought it to about 20% of our electricity mix. Problems are obviously, wind turbines and transmission lines are really hotly resisted by locals. A lot of overlapping domain problems in terms of actually building these transmission lines. It's just one of my favorite places in California is Anza-Borrego, which is a desert park. And in order to really bring solar thermal online, you're going to have to build huge transmission lines right through this wonderful wilderness, which of course I would support as a clean energy advocate, but there's a lot of my colleagues in the environmental movement who would not support that. A lot of folks say, well, we'll just do more efficiency. If we make energy cost more, then people will use less of it and they'll spend money retrofitting their house or installing better windows. But the truth is that there's huge obstacles to people doing more efficiency. A lot of efficiency would pay for itself now without making fossil fuels cost more, and we don't do it for a variety of reasons, including the lack of financing, the fact that often the people that are renting a building are not the same people that own it. There's all sorts of inconvenience in it. And for the CEO of a major company who might save a lot of money doing efficiency, it's one small source of revenue that never seems to get the attention compared to the really big financial transactions of the day. Power plants, it's worth pointing out, are really expensive, between $2 and $5 billion to build big plants. It's not exactly something that like someone can kind of create in his garage in Silicon Valley. As much as we like the idea of somebody's just going to invent a better energy source, these are big plants that require huge amounts of capital. And the final thing is that electricity is a commodity and not a specialty product people will pay more money for. So whereas you might spend $300 buying an iPhone, $200 more than a regular phone because the iPhone has all these great things about it, you're not going to spend much more money for electricity. The vast majority of people are not going to spend more money on electricity because it comes from a clean source. It's been tested in a bunch of markets. Very small percentage of people will pay a little bit more. But for the most part, people they want the electricity as cheap as they can get it. Now, some might ask, is there like a case study somewhere in the world where we could compare my proposal, which is that the government invest in the technologies that we need, and the dominant environmental proposal, which is making fossil fuels cost more? Well, there is, happily, a real-world example. Norway versus Denmark. Both in the early 90s put a modest tax on carbon dioxide pollution. But there was a difference. Norway used the revenue from its tax to fund its social programs. Denmark used its revenue to deploy very large wind turbines. And you can sort of see them here. This was a really amazing innovation that occurred. I don't know if many of you have seen the little dinky windmills we used to have from the 70s. I mean, God bless them, but they're just little, bird blenders. And they don't really produce that much energy, and they're not very efficient. The real innovation happened when they started building these things much larger and where there's much stronger winds. So what the Danes did is the government subsidized and invested in the deployment of these wind turbines offshore and was able to bring the price of wind energy way down. So it became much more, so you can see wind being so much cheaper now. That was because of government investment. Norway's emissions actually increased 43% between 1990 and 2005, which is just scandalous if you know anything about the economics of pollution pricing. The idea that that emissions would go up after you had set up the tax on carbon at all is just shocking to folks, because the models should show that that wouldn't happen. Denmark's emissions actually declined 17%. So what a contrast. And worth pointing out that Denmark had the other benefit of now having the third largest wind industry in the world, and thus obviously being in a much better position in terms of its trade balance. Now, we want to argue that we're just not going to cap our way to a new energy economy. That the idea that we're going to reduce our cap 2% a year against this fundamental political economy where fossil fuels are so much cheaper and there's so much momentum, 100 years of infrastructure investments in fossil fuels. That's really a fantasy. It's a fantasy of people who have sort of fallen in love with an idea. And I'm very sympathetic because I fall in love with ideas, and I try to have people around me that tell me how stupid they are. But it's an idea that people have fallen in love with, and they're sort of, really based on this older model of pollution regulation that as we've seen in the case of acid rain and CFCs, just is at a totally different scale involving completely different technologies. And the only thing that they have in common at all is that they're both pollutants, but that seems to be about it. So again, cheap available alternatives simply do not exist yet. The governments in the world are going to keep carbon prices and fossil fuel prices relatively low. And what that means is that when governments like Europe or in all the proposals in the Congress right now have a cap, the only way for a cap to actually be a cap is for it to come down every year after year and the price of pollution for it to rise to whatever level the market sets it at. And every government in the world that has done this has contained or constrained how much the price of carbon can rise and how much the price of fossil fuels can rise. And they've done that because they know that they will suffer from massive voter backlash if they don't do that. But the punchline is, and this is something that very few people understand still, is that the cap is then not real. It's a cap in name only because the cap is being prevented from being implemented by these constraints on the price. There's going to be very little efficiency as a result, very little investment in the alternatives. Most companies will just buy offsets that are dubious from places like Brazil, where they say, oh yeah, we will decide not to log this forest, and you can pay us not to log the forest. And of course, there's so much forest in Brazil, they can just log somewhere else. Or in China, they would build the dams otherwise. Or firms will borrow from future pollution permits to meet their targets today. That's the most clever and newest of the options. The other thing worth pointing out is that Europe has had a carbon price of $40 a ton, and that price, which was all of the models said that would be a price high enough for all the coal plants to have carbon capture and storage. And in fact, Europe just went ahead and was moving towards building 50 new coal plants, despite all the predictions of the models. Now it's worth pointing out the price of carbon has dropped to $17 a ton because this is the problem with having a market, is that prices not only go up, but they also go down. Now you can see, in terms of our agenda, we've argued that green groups have made a mistake in putting all their political capital into fighting for pollution regulations that really can't work until clean energy becomes a lot cheaper, and not fighting to put more money into R&D. And you can see as a result, there's never been a political lobby or constituency for energy R&D. Right now, energy R&D in the United States gets under $4 billion, which is less than most of the big pharmaceutical companies spend as a single firm on all of their R&D. The Defense Department spends about $80 billion a year on its R&D. Now, one might ask, have we ever transitioned from an older to a newer energy source by making the older energy source more expensive? The answer is no. Every time that humans have gone from an older energy source, like from wood to coal, or from coal to natural gas, or coal to nuclear or solar wind, it's because those new energy sources were cheaper, more convenient, more reliable, and they became that way thanks to government investment, not thanks to regulation. So advocates of the dominant approach for solving the problem of global warming have yet to answer, and I've been in debates, they've yet to answer this question of why would this be different? Why would dealing with global warming simply require us to make the incumbent energy sources more expensive? Why would that work in this situation when it has not been what's worked repeatedly in the past? So I'm going to argue, given that fairly bleak diagnosis of the problem, that we need to have a paradigm shift in the way we think about this challenge. And I use the concept liberally, borrowing from Thomas Kuhn, the great philosopher of science and historian of science, who actually borrowed from a theory of political revolutions to define scientific revolutions or paradigm shifts. He said, political revolutions are inaugurated by a growing sense, often restricted to a segment of the political community, that existing institutions have ceased adequately to meet the problems posed by an environment they have in part created. this obviously we take to mean the segment of the political community being a small group of environmentalists and energy experts and others who think that environmentalism as it's been constituted over the last 30 years is no longer up for dealing with a big challenge like this and should die. It should die and become something else. And that's why the Death of Environmentalism was actually an optimistic essay rather than a pessimistic one, as people thought. So let's take a look at what does that mean exactly for environmentalism to die and become something else. Well, first we have to understand what the birth of environmentalism is imagined to have been. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, and Time magazine published this photograph of the Cuyahoga River on fire. And the idea was pollution has gotten so bad in this country that even our rivers are on fire. The other thing that happened is that we had images of the moon transmitted from the Earth transmitted from outer space. And the idea was people saw this picture of Earth and we understood what a fragile and lonely planet we were and that we needed to take care of it. And then Earth Day happened in 1970. And everything seemed to change. But there's a different story here that challenges this official version of events. The first is that the Cuyahoga River had actually been catching on fire repeatedly since 1868. In fact, the fire in 1912 actually killed 3 people. The fire in 1952 caused millions in damages. The fire in 1969 caused less than $100,000 in damage. And this photo, which Time magazine published in 1969, is actually a photo of the 1952 fire, not of the 1969 fire. Well, why was that? Well, it's because the fire of the 1969 fire photo was so boring. There was no drama. I mean, look at that. That's exciting right there. That, there's some rail ties that got warped. But basically, it was not a major incident, which raises the question, why was the environmental movement born in 1970 and not in 1913 or in 1953? Well, we might start by thinking about an idea that a lot of you probably remember from your high school social studies class. It's that humans have a hierarchy of needs. And the idea here is that as we get our basic needs met, security, for example, we start craving higher needs until we get to much higher needs called self-actualization, which sounds a little frou-frou, but the idea being that making yourself into a unique individual, caring about the world, having some global consciousness. These things actually emerge as we become wealthier and more secure. They do not emerge. Our compassion and empathy does not come out when we are feeling insecure. It comes out when we're feeling secure. And you can see that in that what happened in that post-war era, in the run-up to the birth of the environmental movement, is that we all started living a heck of a lot longer. Look at that. The life expectancy in 1930 was 59. Now it's almost 80. You can see that everybody that needed air conditioners basically got them by 1997, including the poorest Americans. Home ownership radically increased. Private vehicle ownership radically increased. We became a much wealthier country. So now here's a pop quiz. Raise your hand or shout this out if you can tell me which radical environmentalist said the following. The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water? Does anybody know who the radical environmentalist was? Yes, that's right. So there's sort of the idea being there's something about the moment in 1970, because if even Richard Nixon is sounding like an Earth First member, what is it about the 70s that's going on? And we want to suggest that there was something happening during this period of sharp rising affluence. In fact, we find the civil rights movement it wasn't that lynching started in the 1950s. It wasn't that desegregation was implemented in the 1950s. In fact, what you find is this period of rising affluence after World War II gave African Americans greater security and greater confidence to demand full civil rights. And in fact, the leadership of those movements, the people that were first on the front lines, were not the poorest members of the African American community. They were the wealthiest, upper middle class, and intellectuals. Now, back to Cleveland, Cleveland actually considered cleaning up the Cuyahoga in 1912, but then there was a cholera epidemic, and they decided to deal with that first, which is a similar priority that countries like China and India are making. They're like, yeah, we'll get to global warming. I think we'd like to deal with our cholera problem first. Now, that still doesn't answer the question of what is the problem itself in terms of global warming. And I think we're all familiar with those really scary images that we've seen. So it's just worth asking the question, is the whole world coming to an end because of global warming? Well, it sure sometimes looks like it. I mean, that's New Orleans in 2005. If you saw An Inconvenient Truth, you remember Al Gore said it was almost like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. That's the last book in the Bible, in case you don't know, the one that really is the final part of it's a description of humankind's end in a ball of fire. This is, of course, I think probably in this part of the world, we'll probably hear more about the Mayan calendar in 2012, predicting something similar. Well, the truth is that half of New Orleans was built at or below sea level, and meanwhile, we've rapidly developed other vulnerable coastal areas. So it's a bit more complicated story than the world coming to an end. Here's Miami Beach in 1926. Here's Miami Beach in 2006. So when hurricanes hit, you're going to get a lot more damage and a lot more property loss. In fact, Al Gore showed this slide showing an increase in property damage. I mean, look at it, it's dramatic. And Al Gore points to this and says this is evidence of global warming. But in fact, an analysis was done by Munich Re and funded by other very reputable sources, and they concluded that societal change and economic development are the principal factors responsible for the documented increasing losses to date. Also funded by the National Science Foundation, the Tyndall Center, all of which are some of the most mainstream scientific institutions. And it's also a finding that's consistent with the IPCC. So when we look at impacts, we really have to think about how they're going to be different across the world. So in North America, this is pulled directly, I pulled this directly from the United Nations reports. We're going to have decreased snowpack and worse competition for water. And we're actually going to increase agricultural production 5 to 20%, but it will be more variable. We'll have more and longer and more intense heat waves. Coastal communities and habitats will be stressed. Now, in Africa, this is an actual photo, by the way. It looks like something from a movie. Well, they'll have increased water stress, and you can sort of see, I'm trying to dramatize the difference there. Decreased agricultural yields up to 50%, sea level rises by 2100, an increase in arid and semi-arid land by 5 to 8%. So you can see very different impacts between these two countries. And worth pointing out that for Africa, their ability to handle these climate change impacts is vastly improved as they become wealthier. And so when they think about how to become more developed and wealthier and withstand the impacts of global warming, they obviously are going to be looking to the cheapest sources of energy possible, which is what is the irony at the center of the climate change challenge, which is that those who would be most impacted by global warming are the ones who would most benefit from burning cheap fossil fuels. So what we find in the environmental discourse, and when you read the literature, what you find is a story of how global warming is really punishment for having sinned against nature. So it raises the question, is that what's going on? And you can see Gore again, it's human nature to take time, but there will also be a day of reckoning. Well, the truth is that it's a little bit more complicated than that. The number of people living on $2 a day has declined from 4 billion in 1982 to 2 billion today. More than 500 million Chinese have come out of poverty in 20 years, which is a historic record. And child mortality and life expectancy are consistently improving worldwide. So if we're being punished, the question is who's being punished by this? It also raises the question of whether we were ever in harmony with nature. I mean, this looks great, right? I mean, they're just chilling by the river. It looks really happy. And you can sort of see it comes up in the discourse. Here's Rachel Carson. All life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil spell has settled on the community. And in fact, I'm in a set of online debates right now with folks who like to call coal evil. Anybody that sort of questions the dominant paradigm of global warming is evil. The idea being that, that there's sort of a harmonious way to live. This is the beginning of Silent Spring. And that really modernization, human intrusions on nature, all of these things are evil, not problems to be solved, but something fundamentally evil. And in fact, what we find is that when Charles Mann did an extensive history of recent anthropological evidence, he finds that mainstream environmentalists want to preserve as much of the world's land as possible in a putatively intact state. But intact, if the new research is correct, means run by human beings for human purposes. Native Americans managed the continent as they saw fit. He cites evidence of extinctions, of species extinctions by indigenous, native, pre-modern communities, as well as extensive agriculture, including irrigation. And yet, this narrative comes up all the time. So we find Jared Diamond in Collapse saying, as a result of lust for power, Easter Island chiefs and Mayan kings acted so as to accelerate deforestation rather than to prevent it. The idea being that humans and all of our lust for power and our hubris, that's the reason that we succeed or fail. We want to argue that these simplistic golden age stories, where everything in the past was lovely and wonderful, everything in the future is going to be apocalyptic and terrible, are in part a response to the complexity of this stuff, that this is complex and uncertain, and that in the face of that uncertainty and complexity, we rush to a simple story of what happened in the past and a simple story of what's going to happen in the future. So to get a grip on that complexity again, just be reminded of how challenging this problem is just to understand or do the technology on. We think that these apocalyptic cautionary tales may be partly motivated by frustration at political inaction. In other words, we haven't had anything happen on global warming in 20 years in the United States, so it's understandable that when people would write about this, they would kind of fulminate against humans, and we would say, what a reactive primate species we are. That's a very common trope in the environmental literature. And of course, we should acknowledge that apocalypse stories arouse us and might be exciting, even if they're depressing. I was at the laundromat doing my laundry, and there are these two guys talking about the Mayan calendar. I hear it all the time now. 2012, it's the end of the world, and they were so excited. I was like struck by how much fun they were having talking about the end of the world, and I was reminded, there's something arousing about it. We kind of like that stuff. There's something kind of fun to it, but I think we want to argue that ultimately it's counterproductive, and as controversial as that may be. In fact, in our book, we have a chapter that opens with the work of Aaron Beck. He's the psychologist right here on the left, here at the Dalai Lama. He found that depressed people share three core beliefs. My world is bleak, I'm no good, and my future is hopeless. And does that sound familiar at all to you? Now, he invented something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which I do when I take a run. I'm having a bad day. You sort of talk back to yourself. It's like, well, it's not the end, so you didn't, whatever. They didn't want to publish your article, or you didn't get into Harvard. It's not the end of the world. The idea of cognitive therapy is that you have to think differently in order to feel differently, and that moods really matter in terms of what we're able to do in the world. And so we wrote Breakthrough as kind of a cognitive therapy for ourselves and our friends. Is there a different way of understanding the human journey? We also think stories are powerful. Well, there's obviously a very powerful story that this country has told itself, and it's a story of human overcoming, that rather than falling from Eden, we have actually risen from the muck and made ourselves better, living longer, living healthier, and living freer lives, century after century, decades after decades. And how have we done it? Well, one of the big ways is through technology. But in order to understand technology, we have to sort through some of the mythologies around it. The first is that technologies come out of people's garages. This is the garage that Bill Hewlett had when he started Hewlett Packard. And if you live in California or if you've been there, it's a sacred place. This is where it all began. The other myth is that it's just lone geniuses. Here's Edison with his light bulb. Famous photograph. There were literally hundreds of people in his laboratory. He made sure that they all got out of the photograph when he took it. It's done without the help of the government. It's great individuals like Howard Rourke here, Ayn Rand's famous hero, and also an inspiration to Alan Greenspan and others. Government was never involved, of course. Well, here's Hewlett and Packard. I'm not sure what they're doing there, but they look intimate, don't they? They only existed because they got very large wartime contracts for radios. There would be no Hewlett Packard if the Defense Department had not been their biggest customer. In fact, I think maybe their only customer for a long time. Microchips cost $1,000 a chip in the mid-50s. The Defense Department was the sole buyer of them. It bought so many of them that microchips cost $20 a chip in less than 10 years. And now, of course, microchips are everywhere and ushered in the information technology revolution. The internet, here they are. These are the guys that invented it. I always like to put them up there. I like this guy the most. I mean, look at the bow tie and everything. These guys had style. And, you know, here's these terrible government bureaucrats wasting your money inventing the internet, which, as we all know, was a colossal failure. Here's the Pacific Railway. We forget the railroads. We forget that Lincoln, before he got caught up in that whole Civil War thing, was in fact famous for being a modernizer, an advocate of canal building, road building, railroads. He was someone that was a big supporter of government investment in infrastructure and technology, and of course the interstate highway system after World War II. And my other favorite photograph, here are the guys that laid out the basis for the European Union. It was actually called the European Coal and Steel Partnership. Churchill and a few other visionaries came up with the idea that if you wanted to have peace in Europe, you needed to have economic prosperity and you needed to have economic unification. And the way to do that was through a joint partnership in energy. And what a great model for the situation we're in right now, where the whole world needs to rebuild and the developing world needs to build for the first time and do it in a way that doesn't wreck the climate. So there's some paradigm shifts that are needed. The first is that global warming should be understood as an unintended consequence of human development, not our punishment for violating nature. The consequences of global warming will fall disproportionately on undeveloped countries. We need to tell a story of overcoming, not of falling from nature. We need to feel gratitude to our ancestors for providing us with so much wealth and freedom, not a sense of guilt about our existence. We need to focus on investment in the future, not sacrifice. Our policy focus should be on energy technology modernization, not pollution regulation. We need to acknowledge that we will overtly manage nature and the market. I spent most of the time here critiquing environmentalism, but of course, for conservatives, the market has been their nature. The thing that they say, if you mess with it, it will collapse. Of course, we've seen that the market has collapsed due to the lack of human intervention. And we need to, most importantly, make clean energy cheap. That's what humans do well. We make stuff cheaply, and we can do it. We have a much more detailed and less exciting policy proposal that you can read on our website to invest about $50 billion a year. There's our boy. The bad news is, there's still lots of bad news, just in case you thought you were done. Carbon pricing is still widely seen among elites as capable of doing far more than it can. Obama has far too little in his budget for clean energy, about a third of what's needed. The focus is still on targets and timetables, despite the fact that nobody ever meets their targets according to their timetables. And Obama's reluctance to clean up the banks, which some people call nationalization, is really a temporary cleaning up of temporary nationalization and reprivatization, is going to increase the cost to taxpayers and slow the recovery. So the lack of courage in confronting the banks is making things worse for all of us. But the good news is that we have seen environmentalists, Democrats, and Obama really stop talking. I mean, I just haven't heard a lot of mention of polar bears and ice caps for like a year. And everything but talking green jobs is just everywhere. It's just like, there's nothing, it's like mom, apple pie, and green jobs. So all the apocalyptic stuff, I think, has faded away. I think cap and trade is increasingly seen by elites as a way to raise money more than a way to reduce emissions, which is the right way to see it. And you look at Al Gore. I mean, I was beating up on him so much, but what a change. I mean, I don't know if you've seen these Repower America ads. They're fabulous. And he also came out and apologized for being against adaptation last summer, which I thought was very big of him. And I think he really has really drank the Kool-Aid on the need to have much more of this kind of message. And I think that public investment is now widely seen as part of the solution. We would like it to be understood as the central and primary solution, but feel like we've made a bit of progress in moving that debate. Thank you very much.